The door wasn't locked. That was the first thing I noticed. The front door of my own house hanging open about 2 inches, letting the October wind push itself in uninvited. I'd been gone 11 months. 11 months working cattle drives across 3 states, sleeping in the cab of my truck when the bunkhouses were full, eating whatever came out of a can that didn't require much heating. I was 34 years old, and I smelled like road and horse and something close to loneliness. I pushed the door open with my boot. I want you to understand what I walked into, because it still doesn't fully make sense to me even now, even after everything that came after. She was sitting on my kitchen floor. Not on a chair. Not on the couch. The floor. Back against the cabinet under the sink, knees pulled to her chest. Wearing nothing but a man's flannel shirt. My flannel shirt, the old red one I'd left hanging on the hook by the back door. And it wasn't buttoned right. She had it fastened crooked. 2 buttons off from the start, and she didn't seem to notice or care. Her hair was black and long and loose, falling forward over her knees like a curtain she was hiding behind. She didn't look up when I came in. She was staring at something on the linoleum. Nothing was there. Just the floor pattern, those old cream and brown squares my grandmother had put down in 1971 that I'd always meant to replace. She was staring at it like it held an answer she was still waiting on. I stood in the doorway for a moment. A long moment. I set my duffel bag down slow, so it wouldn't startle her. "Hey," I said. It was all I had. Her head came up then. Eyes dark and steady. The kind of eyes that have already decided they're done flinching. There were dried tear tracks on her face. Not fresh, dried. Like she'd been crying for a long time and then simply stopped. Run out of whatever fuel crying needs to keep going. She looked at me without embarrassment. Without apology. Like she'd been caught sitting on someone's kitchen floor in a borrowed shirt before, and had stopped feeling shame about it. "I didn't know anyone lived here," she said. Her voice was quiet, flat. Not flat like nothing was behind it. Flat like she was working real hard to keep whatever was behind it from coming out all at once. "Been gone a while," I said. "I'll go." She started to push herself up. I noticed her feet were bare. Bare feet on an October floor, and it wasn't a warm October. Something about that, the bare feet, landed in my chest in a way I didn't fully understand yet. "You don't have to," I said. She stopped, looked at me, trying to read if I meant it, or if I was just being polite the way people are polite when they actually want you to leave but don't want to say so. "I mean it," I said. "Sit down. My name is Cole Whitaker. I grew up on that land, 63 acres outside of Gallup, New Mexico, right where the high desert starts pretending it might become something softer, and then changes its mind. My grandmother raised me after my parents did what they did, which I won't get into except to say it involved a pickup truck and a bottle and a highway, and I was 8 years old when it happened. She left me the land and the house, and a general suspicion of getting too attached to people, because people go. I'd been driving cattle north and east, and wherever they needed driving, because that's what I knew how to do, and because being in motion kept me from noticing too much how quiet the house was. I'd come home to check on the place. Wasn't planning to stay long. I put a pot of coffee on because that's what you do. I didn't ask her questions. I could see she was in some kind of terrible place, and I'd learned from my grandmother that when someone is in a terrible place, the worst thing you can do is pepper them with questions. Questions feel like an interrogation when what you need is just to be let alone inside a warm room. I made coffee. I made scrambled eggs because there were eggs from the neighbor's hens I kept in my absence. Old Donovan, 2 miles down, who watered my plants in exchange for the use of my pasture. I found bread that was still good. I made toast. I set a plate on the floor next to her because she hadn't moved off the floor, and I wasn't going to make her feel wrong for that. She looked at the plate for a moment. "I haven't eaten since yesterday," she said. "I know," I said. I didn't know. But it seemed like the right thing to say, the kind of thing that tells someone you're not going to make them explain themselves. She ate. Slow at first, then, like she remembered she was hungry. I sat across from her on the kitchen floor, with my back against the opposite cabinet, which wasn't comfortable at 34 with the amount of miles I had on my lower back. But I didn't want to sit above her, didn't want to tower over whatever was happening here. "My name's Cole," I said. She looked at me for a long moment. Nadia, she said. Running water. Navajo. I'd figured as much. The cheekbones, the coloring. Gallup is close enough to the nation that this wasn't unusual, but finding her in my house was unusual by any measure. How'd you get here, Nadia? Walked. I waited. From the highway, she added. The 491, that was 4 miles. Barefoot, I'd find out later. October in New Mexico at elevation, the ground already hard from the cold at night. She'd walked 4 miles barefoot across high desert to end up on my kitchen floor. I didn't ask why she'd been on the highway. Not yet. I just filed it. I made up the spare room for her. My grandmother's old room. It still had her things in it. Mostly, a quilt she'd made from pieces of shirts that had belonged to people she loved. A little table with a lamp that had a yellowed shade. I put clean sheets on. I found a pair of sweatpants in a drawer that I thought might be close to her size in a thicker shirt. I knocked on the open door. It's not much, I said. She was standing in the middle of the room, looking at the quilt. Her fingers were hovering over it, not quite touching, like she wasn't sure she was allowed. Touch it, I said. She'd have wanted you to. She pressed her hand flat against the quilt. A long exhale came out of her, the kind that has been held for a very long time. Your grandmother made this? Yeah, she's gone? 6 years now. She nodded. She understood things about loss, I could see that. It moved across her face the way water moves, there and then smooth again. Thank you, she said. For the room. Get some sleep. I went to my own room, which smelled of dust and absence, and I lay on my back in the dark, listening to the wind work at the windows. And I thought about barefoot women walking 4 miles from a highway in October, and what drives a person to that, and whether it was my business to know. In the morning, she was in the kitchen when I came out. She'd found the coffee. She was standing at the window that looks east, holding her mug with both hands, watching the sunrise do what it does over the desert. That impossible slow bleed of orange and gold that makes you feel for a moment like the world is still mostly okay. She'd found a pair of my socks, the thick wool ones. They were too big for her, and she'd folded the tops down and she looked, I don't know. She looked like someone trying to be okay. That particular human effort. You sleep, I said. Some. I started breakfast again because it was something to do with my hands while I figured out how to say the next thing. I'm not going to push you, I said. But I need to know if someone's looking for you. Not to find you. I mean someone who'd hurt you. Someone I should know is out there. She was quiet for a bit. No, she said, not like that. Okay, it's not. She stopped, started again. It wasn't someone else's doing. What happened? All right, it was mine. She turned from the window then and looked at me, and I saw it. What I'd felt the night before but hadn't let myself name. There was something in her eyes that I recognized because I'd seen it in the mirror a time or two. Years ago, after the accident, after the house got very quiet, and I was alone in it at age 8, waiting for people to tell me what came next. It was the look of someone who has decided, somewhere deep and quiet in themselves, that maybe they're done. Not dramatic, not loud, just done. How close, I said. She knew what I was asking. She looked back at the sunrise. The highway, she said. I was going to wait for a truck. The breath I took in didn't come easy. She said it like she was telling me about the weather, like it was already something that had happened instead of something that hadn't. Yet. And that scared me more than any version of this I could have imagined. I want to tell you what I did next, because I've thought about it a lot, and I'm still not sure I did it right. There's no manual for this. Nobody hands you a guide when you walk into your house and find someone on your kitchen floor who has been standing on a highway waiting for a truck. I didn't call anyone. I didn't tell her she had to talk about it. I didn't give her a list of hotlines or tell her things would get better in that hollow way people say things will get better because they don't know what else to say. What I did was, I sat down at the kitchen table and I said, I lost 3 people in one night when I was 8 years old. My parents and the man they hit. I used to sit on the front porch and think about how it was just a matter of time before the universe decided to finish the job. I'm not going to tell you that feeling isn't real, because it's the realest feeling I've ever felt. She turned from the window. She sat down across from me. What happened? She said. Eventually, something else happened. Something small. My grandmother found me on the porch at 2 in the morning and didn't ask me anything. She just sat down beside me and said, I made biscuits. They're going to get cold. And I don't know why that worked. But I went in and ate biscuits. And I went to bed, and in the morning I was still here. Nadia looked at her coffee mug. What happened to you? I asked. She told me over the course of that morning and into the afternoon. Not all at once. It came in pieces. The way hard things always come. The way you can only look at something terrible for a few seconds before you have to look away. Her daughter, 3 years old. A car seat that wasn't latched right. She'd thought it was. She'd checked it. She'd always checked it. But the latch mechanism on those seats can fail, and hers had. And the truck that ran the red light 3 months ago had done what trucks do when they run red lights. The little girl's name was Sage. She told me the name like it was something she was handing me very carefully with both hands. She liked horses, Nadia said. We didn't even own horses. She'd just seen pictures. She'd never been near one. But she'd drag me to the library and find all the books with horses in them, and we'd sit there for hours. I didn't say anything. Her father left when she was 6 months old. It was just us, just the two of us. And I thought, her voice went thin here, she pressed on. I thought I'd figured out how to make that enough. How to be enough, and then. She stopped. And then she was gone, she said. And I kept waiting for a reason. I kept looking around for some reason I was still here if she wasn't. And I couldn't find one. I looked for 3 months and I couldn't find one. Outside, the wind was moving across the sage and the dry grass, and the light was the particular pale gold of a high desert noon, and the world was doing what the world does, continuing. And I thought about how cruel that is, sometimes, how the world just continues. She liked horses, I said. Yeah, I've got horses. Nadia looked at me. They're at Donovan's right now. Neighbor down the road keeps them when I'm gone, but they come home when I'm home. I've got a bay mare named Callie, who's the most patient horse alive. She'd have let your daughter sit on her back and just stand there all day. Something moved across Nadia's face. It was close to pain and close to something else. I know that's not, I said. I'm not trying to. No, she said. It's okay, tell me about Callie. So I did. I told her about Callie, who I'd had for 9 years, who had this habit of pressing her nose against your shoulder when you were sad in the way horses sometimes know. I told her about the land, about my grandmother, about how this desert looks in every season and how spring comes here differently than anywhere else. Not green, exactly, but alive. The way alive sometimes looks like purple and red and gold instead of green. And somewhere in the telling of those things I realized what I was doing, which was the same thing my grandmother did with the biscuits. I was saying, there are still things here. There are still things. Not instead of sage. Not better than sage. Not compensation or replacement or any of the terrible bargains grief tries to make. Just things that exist. In the same world where she lost her daughter, there is also a patient bay mare who presses her nose against your shoulder when you're sad. Nadia listened to all of it. She stayed. Not because I asked her to. I want to be clear about that. She stayed because she chose to, one day at a time, which is the only way anyone stays anywhere, really. The first week she mostly slept. Grief takes it out of you physically in a way that nothing else does. It's like your body is doing enormous invisible labor, and sleep is the only thing that makes a dent in it. I'd make food and leave it, and not hover. I'm not a hoverer by nature, so this wasn't hard. I called Donovan and told him to bring the horses back. The morning they came home, Nadia was at the fence before I'd even finished my first cup of coffee. I watched from the porch. Callie walked right up to her, didn't hesitate, just walked up and pressed that big nose against Nadia's shoulder. Nadia put her forehead against Callie's neck and stood there for a long time. I looked away. That was a private thing. She called her mother at the end of the first week. I gave her the house phone. Mine still got no signal out here, which I'd always considered a feature, and went out to the barn and found things to do with fence posts that didn't need doing for another 6 months. When I came back in, she'd been crying, the kind that sounds ragged and ugly and human. She was at the kitchen table with her face in her hands and her shoulders shaking. I sat across from her and didn't say anything. After a while it slowed down. My mother thought I was dead, she said. I figured, she's coming, she wants to come get me. A pause. Is it okay if she comes here? Of course it's okay. She looked at me with those steady dark eyes that had a little more warmth in them now than they'd had that first night. Not healed. You don't heal from something like this in a week, but warmer. Why are you doing this? She asked. I thought about it. My grandmother, I said. She did this for me. And I didn't understand it then. I thought she just liked biscuits. Something that was almost a smile moved across Nadia's face. The first one I'd seen. She sounds like she was a good woman. The best I knew. Her mother came 2 days later. She was a small woman, Margaret Runningwater, with the same dark eyes as her daughter, and gray, in her hair, and the kind of stillness comes the significant things through significant things with some measure of grace. She looked at me for a long moment when I answered the door like she was taking inventory. You're Cole, she said. Yes, ma'am. My daughter says you found her. She found me, more or less. Ma house was closer than she knew. Margaret Runningwater looked at me for another moment, then nodded once, like that was an acceptable answer, and came inside. She and Nadia were in my grandmother's room for most of the afternoon. I could hear them talking, not the words. Just the sound of two women speaking in low voices. The particular music of a mother and daughter finding their way back to each other. That evening, the three of us ate dinner at the kitchen table, and Margaret told me about the land her family was from. Up near Chinley, the way the canyon looks in the late afternoon, when the light goes red and gold on the sandstone walls. I told her about my grandmother's biscuits. Nadia sat between us and ate more than I'd seen her eat since she'd been here. Margaret stayed 3 days. On the last evening, she found me on the porch, which is where I go when I need to think, and she sat in the other chair. My grandmother's chair, which no one ever sat in. And she looked out at the desert going purple and amber in the dusk. She's not ready to come home yet, Margaret said. Okay. That okay with you? Yes, ma'am. She was quiet for a bit. I want to ask you something, she said, and I want you to answer me honestly. All right. Are you going to hurt her? I sat with that for a moment. Not because it was a hard question, but because it deserved a real answer, not a quick one. No, I said. I'm not. You sure? I'm sure of very few things, Margaret, but I'm sure of that. She looked at me one more time in that inventory way of hers. Okay, she said. She left the next morning, and Nadia stood at the end of the drive and watched her go, and then turned and came back inside. And I had the strange quiet realization that my house, which had been empty for 11 months, which had been empty in some way for years longer than that, was not empty anymore. The thing I have to tell you about those weeks, there's no dramatic version of it. No single moment where everything changed. It was the accumulation of small things, which is how the most important things almost always happen. She started helping with the horses, not because I asked. She just showed up at the barn one morning with her coffee and started doing what needed doing. She was good with them. Animals know things about people that we have to take a long time to figure out. And Callie was easy around her from the start. She started talking about Sage. Not every day, but some days she'd tell me something. That Sage had been afraid of thunder until Nadia taught her that thunder was the sky rearranging its furniture. And after that, she'd point at the sky during storms and say rearranging, with great satisfaction. That Sage had a favorite blanket that was a particular shade of yellow. That she smelled like baby shampoo. And something else. Something Nadia said she could only describe as her. I listened to all of it. There is an art to listening to grief that no one teaches you. The main thing is to resist the impulse to make it smaller than it is. You don't say at least or you'll get through this or time heals. You just stay. You receive it. You let it be as big as it is. In return, she listened to me. My grandmother's death, which I'd never properly processed. My parents, which I'd never properly processed either. 11 months of empty roads and eating from cans. The particular loneliness of being someone who left before people could leave him. You know you did that, right? She said once. Left before anyone could. I know. Why'd you come back this time? I looked at my coffee. I'm not sure, I said. The door was open, I think. She understood what I meant by that. November came and brought the first real cold. I taught her to ride. Not formally. I'm not a teacher. I'm impatient in small ways with things that should be easy. But Callie was patient enough for both of us. And Nadia learned the way people learn things when they actually want to know them, which is quickly and quietly, and with total attention. The first time she took Callie out alone, down the fence line and back. Nothing complicated. I watched from the barn door and felt something so unfamiliar in my chest that it took me a while to identify it. Pride. I felt proud of her. Not in a condescending way. In the way you feel proud of anyone who decides, despite everything, to try something. She came back grinning. A real grin. The kind that reaches all the way up and doesn't apologize for itself. It was the first time I'd seen her whole face smile. "She's wonderful," Nadia said. "Yeah," I said. "She is. We weren't talking about the horse. Or maybe we were. Both things were true. The night I knew, and I want to be careful here, because I don't want to make this into something that erases what came before, the weight of it, the reality of what she'd lost. But the night I knew something had shifted in me past the point where it could shift back. It was late. We'd had a fire in the wood stove, and we'd been sitting on opposite ends of the couch, which had become our usual arrangement, comfortable and quiet. And she'd fallen asleep with her head tipped back and her hands loose in her lap. I looked at her for a long moment. She was alive. That was the whole thought. She was alive, and she was in my house, and the fire was going, and outside the stars over the desert were doing their thing, which is being incomprehensibly numerous, and she was alive. I turned off the lamp and put another log on the fire and went to my room. And I lay in the dark and I thought about how thin the line is. How 4 miles of highway and an unlocked door had been the whole difference. And I felt something enormous and precarious, like standing at the edge of a thing you don't have good words for. I told her in December, not elegantly. I want to be honest about that. I am not an elegant man. I said it badly. And at a wrong moment, she was washing dishes, which is not when you want to be told something significant. And I said it wrong, because I've never been good at saying things that matter. What I said was, "I think I love you." I know that's a strange thing to say. I know the timings is, and then I ran out of words, which is what happens to me. She turned off the water. She turned around. She looked at me for a long time in that way of hers, taking inventory, reading me. "Cole," she said. "Yeah. I've been trying to figure out what to do with how I feel about you for about 6 weeks. I stared at her. "I don't want to be someone who," she started. "Sage is still, she'll always be." "I know," I said. "And this isn't." "I know. I'm not healed," she said. "I'm not going to be healed. You know that, right? This isn't a story where I get better and everything gets fixed. I'm going to have hard days forever. I'm going to miss her every day for the rest of my life. If you need it to get fixed to be." "Nadia," I said. "Yeah? I lived in this house alone for a long time before you got here. I know what it looks like when things get fixed. This isn't that. This is different," she breathed. "What is it?" she asked. "I don't know yet," I said, "but I'd like to find out." I crossed the kitchen. She let me come. And when I put my arms around her, carefully, like I understood what I was holding, she leaned in, and I felt her shoulders drop. And she pressed her forehead against my collarbone. And we stood there in my grandmother's kitchen, while the December wind worked at the windows, and I held on. She felt small and strong at the same time. People who have survived terrible things often do. "I'm still here," she said, into my shirt. "Yeah," I said. "I didn't know I'd be glad about that." "Are you?" A long pause. "Yeah," she said. "I am. I'm not going to wrap this up too neat because life doesn't wrap up neat, and I wouldn't insult you by pretending it does." She went back to her mother's in January to deal with things that needed dealing with. The apartment, Sage's things, the business of a life that had been interrupted. It was hard. She called me most evenings. We talked for a long time about everything and nothing. The mare, the weather, what her mother had made for dinner, a book she was reading, a memory of Sage that she'd been carrying around all day and needed somewhere to put. I painted the spare room, the one that was my grandmother's. I'm not a painter. I did a mediocre job. But I painted it the color she'd said she liked once. A particular warm sand color, close to the canyon walls she'd described near Chinley. She came back in March. She walked in the door with 2 bags and looked at the room and was quiet for a moment. "You painted it," she said. "Yeah." "Badly." "No," she said. "It's right." She put her bags down. She stood in the middle of the room, the same way she'd stood the first night, but different, nothing like the same, and she touched the quilt. "Hi," she said to my grandmother. "To the quilt, to the room, to whatever remains in the places where people we love lived and loved in return." Then she came back out to the kitchen where I was standing, and she looked at me, and I looked at her. And the desert light was coming through the window, the way it does in March. Still cold, but something in it already planning towards spring. Okay, she said. Okay, I said. Callie still presses her nose against Nadia's shoulder every morning. We scattered some of Sage's ashes out near the canyon, where the light goes red and gold, with Margaret there and the wind doing what the wind does, carrying things forward, carrying things somewhere. My house doesn't sound empty anymore. Not because the hard things are gone. They don't go. But because we stopped being alone inside them. That's the whole of it. That's what I have. I came home to an open door and a woman with bare feet on a cold floor, and something in me, something old and stubborn that had been keeping itself very still for a long time, recognized her. Not because she needed saving. She never needed saving. She needed a kitchen floor to sit on, and time, and a patient mare, and someone who knew how to stay. Turns out I'd been practicing that without knowing it. All those years of going nowhere, I'd been learning how to stay.